And thank you very much to members of Shannon Éireann for affording me some time and affording this House some time to talk about the extensive work that we all are doing and wish to do to combat all forms of violence against women, including to change the social and cultural attitudes that can often underpin such horrific crimes. Ending sexual and gender-based violence and abuse is an obligation. We simply must do it. There's no other option, and we need a zero-tolerance approach. That's not to say it won't be challenging, but I can assure you it's a challenge that we are determined to meet. From what might have been seen as the lowest level of unacceptable behaviours right through to the most serious, we will work towards a society that does not accept any level of violence or abuse against women. One important aspect of this is counteracting the norms that facilitate the insidiousness of this behaviour. The assumption that elements of it are somehow a lesser form of abuse, that things that happen online are not really that serious, or the suggestion that private suffering is not a public responsibility. Writing about these types of appalling behaviours in the Sunday Times recently, Louise O'Neill said, "Men's sense of entitlement to the female body is not a new problem. Social media has simply given them a new tool." I want to reassure you that we recognise that counteracting these norms is a vital element in ending violence against women, and it is one of the areas that we are specifically targeting. As you're aware, my colleague Minister McEntee published the third National Strategy on Domestic, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence last June, and implementation has well and truly begun. This is an ambitious whole-of-government 5-year programme of reform built on the 4 pillars of the Istanbul Convention: protection, prevention, prosecution and policy coordination. It is entitled Zero Tolerance. Its fundamental aim and our North Star is to bring about changes in attitudes and in systems to ensure that our society has zero tolerance for any and all forms of these crimes. And that determination to change is reflected throughout the document. It's why this strategy is not just about a criminal justice approach, important as that is. It's not only about how we can improve policing or the court system or change legislation, although all of these and other areas are addressed and are vitally important, but it's also about involving wider society. It's about engaging with everyone to change attitudes and to combat this violence and abuse. It's about men doing better. It's about men recognising that they need to do more. It's about fathers doing better. It's about fathers recognising we have a duty in how we raise our sons. It's about politicians doing better. It's about politicians recognising that we need to change the system. Quite frankly, it's about everyone doing more and doing better. Because it's only through a whole-of-government, whole-of-society effort we will reach that goal of zero tolerance, and ensuring a developmental impact of the attitudes of men and boys, whilst also empowering women and girls. A detailed implementation plan, which will run to the end of this year, was published alongside the strategy. It assigns responsibility for the delivery of 144 actions, and it provides clear timeframes for doing so. Further implementation plans will be published for each subsequent year of the strategy. I can assure this House that what is achieved this year in implementing our zero tolerance strategy is only the start. Nonetheless, it is significant. The overall cost of implementing the entire strategy is estimated to be in the region of €363 million. The actions are drawn from across government departments and state agencies, again reflecting that fundamental truth that our North Star zero tolerance can only be achieved if we all work towards it. Specific actions are included to establish a dedicated domestic, sexual and gender-based violence agency under the remit of my department, and I've just come from a briefing with stakeholders and people working on the front line with victims and survivors of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence from right across the country. They're in the department today helping us co-design this agency, listening to their voice, the expertise that they have, the voice of the victim, the voice of the survivors, so we get this right. The plan will also double the number of refuge spaces over the lifetime of the strategy. We're also improving and increasing the supports available and putting in place new structures to ensure that we as a state continue to deliver the systems and supports that victims and survivors deserve. This work includes making sure that procedures and processes are in place to hold perpetrators to account, that we have a victim-centred criminal justice system which supports victims from the moment they report a crime right through to the court proceedings and beyond, that the full range of supports and services are available to victims of these terrible crimes regardless of where they live, and that we continue to work with society to educate and raise awareness of all forms of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, and to enable everyone to question and change problematic behaviour. The new agency will work collaboratively with the NGO and service providers to ensure the best possible services are in place to meet the needs of victims and survivors. It will have a specific mandate to drive the implementation of the zero tolerance strategy across government. For the first time, we will have people whose only job, whose full-time job, is the delivery, the coordination of this strategy to ensure that we bring that expertise and that focus to tackle this complex but vital social issue. Work to draft the heads of a general scheme to establish the agency is progressed, and I intend to go to government with permission to publish that draft law by the end of the month. One of the overarching goals of the strategy is to ensure that everyone who needs a refuge space will get one. We'll double the number of refuge spaces over the lifetime of the strategy, bringing it to 280. The two-step review of accommodation services for victims of domestic, sexual and gender-based violence identified priority locations where between 50 and 60 new refuge places are needed. Further analysis undertaken identified 12 locations nationwide where the delivery of 98 family refuge spaces would have the most impact if prioritised. In the initial phase of work, we expect to have delivered extra places in Wexford, Dundalk and Navan by next year. There will be 98 refuge units in priority locations delivered by 2025, along with a further 19 additional upgraded units by the end of the strategy. There were also 32 safe home units operational at the end of 2022, with plans to expand this to 55 by the end of this year. We've significantly underprovided emergency accommodation for victims of domestic violence, and I fully acknowledge the need for a significant increase in the provision of both refuge spaces and safe homes. I'm committed to achieving this in order to ensure that victims have a safe place when they need it. And the work being done in this area demonstrates determination across the board to support and protect some of the most vulnerable people. But let me be clear, doubling the number of refuge places under the lifetime of this strategy is the start and not the end. It absolutely can't be the end, and subsequent strategies will build on what we achieve between now and 2026. As I mentioned earlier, this plan is not dominated by a focus on the criminal justice approach alone, but of course this must remain and does remain a key and core element for me as Minister for Justice. As part of delivering on the actions contained in the strategy, I will bring forward 4 significant pieces of legislation in the coming weeks and months. The Government has approved the publication of a bill which will increase from 5 years to 10 years the maximum sentence for assault causing harm, one of the most common offences in domestic violence cases. This new legislation, which is currently before the Houses, also contains provisions to make stalking and non-fatal strangulation standalone offences, and I note the interest in the leadership of the Chair and others in this area in the last number of months. While both are already crimes, this will make the law clearer and stronger. We know stalking is an extremely serious and intrusive crime that can cause devastating psychological distress. The evidence is that when a specific stalking offence is introduced, it leads to greater awareness of the crime and an increase in the number of crimes reported and ultimately prosecuted. So we're doing that. International research suggests that a history of non-fatal strangulation presents a 7-fold increase in the risk of death. Internationally, strangulation is the second most common method of killing in adult female homicides. Research also highlights that non-fatal strangulation is frequently used as a tool of coercion, often accompanied by the threat to kill. So we're acting on that. The Incitement to Violence and Hatred and Hate Offences Bill, which is also before the Houses, will introduce new specific aggravated offences with enhanced penalties for crimes motivated by prejudice against certain characteristics, including gender. I'll also seek to enact the Sex Offenders Bill, which will strengthen the management and monitoring of sex offenders in the community, and it will allow for electronic tagging of sex offenders and for the Gardaí to disclose information about previous convictions to a member or members of the public where the sex offender poses a risk causing harm. And I'm also updating sexual offences legislation, including updating the law around consent and by introducing many reforms which are in line with commitments in supporting a victim's journey, including extending anonymity provisions and legal representation to further categories of victims, as well as repealing provisions for sentences to be delivered in public. I know there has been an increased reporting of sexual violence over recent years, and we're determined to ensure that our system supports every victim that takes that brave step to report. Indeed, over the course of the last 2 years, there have been significant strides made in supporting a victim's journey. I won't list them all, but it does include better training for professionals of the criminal justice system, the establishment of a new course in the University of Limerick to train intermediaries, the rollout of a divisional protective service unit in each Garda division. That's now in place. Every Garda division, and every woman should know this, every citizen should know this, every person should know this. No matter where you live in Ireland now, there is a divisional protective service unit in every Garda division, and each of them have now been fully trained. There's been the establishment of a specialist unit in the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions. There's the introduction of preliminary trial hearings. There's the provision of extra funding for organisations supporting victims to address gaps in service provision, and the work continues. And I really want to assure people in relation to this, we are going to take, as an Oireachtas, concrete steps, I hope, between now and the summer to make sure strangulation is that standalone offence, to make sure that we can double the maximum sentence for assault causing harm, to make sure that our courts can electronically tag sex offenders in this country. We're going to publish a bill to make sure we overhaul how we deal with sexual offences and give victims representation in the court. So when someone is being cross-examined, it's not someone representing the defendant, someone representing the state, and nobody looking out for the interests of the victim. These are things we can do, practical things we can do in these houses, and we can do them quickly to make a real difference. But can I also say, in the very brief seconds available to me, we also have to do much more than this. And I won't have time to get into it now. But the Andrew Tate scenario, if I may call it that, where parents across the country are now realising where their kids are getting information from, the power of social media, the abuse on social media, the lack of proper sex education, the lack of age-appropriate information, is, I believe, causing real challenges. And I believe beginning to introduce children to concepts like consent when they're in higher education is far too late. And there's very specific elements in the strategy that we need to deliver on if we're to bring about cultural change also. Gurmagat.
Minister.